So we're going to start this session. This is a webinar about Chapter 9 in your biology textbook, which is part of Lesson 2. We're going to cover all the sections in this chapter. We're going to have some practice questions on here, but they're not anything to be graded. They're just practice questions. So the way they're set up today, you actually don't even have a chance to answer them. They're just going to be on the screen. But you can ask questions. So again, if you're on a computer, you would click on the little speech bubble icon, or if you're on a phone or tablet, you click on the question mark icon, and those will bring up the option to type questions. So if you have any questions about what we're talking about, if you need me to go back and go over something again, if you didn't understand part of it, if I need to slow down, or if you have any questions about something else in this lesson, you can feel free to ask. You're not interrupting at all. Just go ahead and type some questions. So we have discussed before that everything your body does requires energy. Even while you are sleeping, you are breathing, your heart is beating, and the organelles in your cells are hard at work. All of this work relies on chemical reactions that use up energy. You know that you get energy by eating food and that your body breaks it down to release that energy, but what actually happens? That's what we're looking at. So the process of digestion uses chemical reactions to break down big pieces of food into molecules. But the molecules that store chemical energy then get to cells, and the process of cellular respiration makes usable energy for your cells from those molecules. This happens in the cells of almost all types of living things. So people, animals, plants, fungus, bacteria, protists, they're all using cellular respiration to break down molecules and get that energy. So how does this work? What are they actually doing? Cellular respiration uses the chemical energy. It's a series of chemical reactions that use this chemical energy stored in certain molecules, particularly glucose, to make ATP. ATP is a molecule that is great for carrying energy around the cell and releasing it to fuel chemical reactions. Although cellular respiration is a long series of reactions, we can look at an overview of the whole process as one big chemical reaction. In cellular respiration, 6 oxygen molecules and 1 glucose molecule are used, and 6 carbon dioxide molecules and 6 water molecules and a lot of energy are produced. So there's other molecules involved in between, but they don't necessarily get used up. They're just there to be part of the machinery, but this is what goes in and gets used up, and this is what is created. And you may remember that photosynthesis had an overall equation too. And if we compare them, we see that respiration is almost the exact opposite of photosynthesis. The products of photosynthesis are used in respiration, and the products of respiration are used in photosynthesis. The two processes form a cycle of using and releasing carbon dioxide, oxygen, and water. There are 3 main phases to cellular respiration. Glycolysis is the first stage, and it takes place in the cytoplasm of the cell. It's important to note that no oxygen is used in glycolysis. The term for that is an anaerobic process. The other 2 phases take place in cellular organelles called mitochondria. The 2 phases of the Krebs cycle, the 2 phases are the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain. And those are both aerobic processes, meaning they do require a lot of oxygen. So we'll look at each of these stages in more depth, but first we've got a review question. Just to go over some of what we've learned already, we've got some review questions spread throughout this presentation. So which of the following require oxygen to happen? Glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, or electron transport chain? So I'll give you a few seconds to think about it, and then we'll go over the answer. Okay, so requiring oxygen. We learned on the last slide that glycolysis does not. Glycolysis is anaerobic. It does not require oxygen. But the other two, Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain, they are aerobic processes. They do require oxygen. So let's look at them in some more depth. The process of glycolysis begins with a glucose molecule being split in two. More chemical reactions that change these two glucose chunks into two molecules of a chemical called pyruvic acid. And meanwhile, an NAD plus ion has been turned into NADH. And NADH is a molecule that carries around high energy electrons. So we learned about this with photosynthesis. There's certain molecules whose job it is just to take a high energy electron and carry it around to somewhere else. And it's a way to move the energy from one place to another. So NAD plus is not useful for that, but then you turn it into NADH, and NADH is the electron carrier. Okay, so an NAD plus ion is turned into NADH, which is a molecule that carries around the high energy electrons. And to do this, the process of glycolysis uses energy from two ATP molecules, and it creates four ATP molecules. That means for a net gain of two ATP molecules from glycolysis. So this should say creates. I'm sorry, it's very hard to write with the mouse. All right, so it uses two ATP molecules. It creates four ATP molecules, so that means it's still ahead by two ATP molecules. And if you'll remember, ATP is a molecule that's really great at holding energy to take it around the cell. So you're going to see that we focus a lot on how many ATP molecules are produced when and where. Okay, and to summarize glycolysis again, glycolysis uses one glucose molecule and two ATP molecules, and it creates four ATP molecules. Two pyruvic acid molecules, and those will get sent to the Krebs cycle, the next step, and it creates two NADH molecules that get sent to the electron transport chain. They're carrying those high energy electrons. And it's important to remember that it does this without using any oxygen. So the second stage is the Krebs cycle. The Krebs cycle uses pyruvic acid and some molecules that are already present in the mitochondria to make and break citric acid. As it continually does this, it is creating and releasing more NADH and another electron carrier called FADH2, and it creates two ATP molecules. It also makes and releases carbon dioxide as a waste product. You can see page 219 in your textbook for more details on the Krebs cycle, but you need to know that its main job is to create electron carriers So there's two of them. There's NADH and FADH2. So it creates these electron carriers to take high energy electrons to the third stage of respiration, and it also creates these two ATP molecules. So before we move on to the third stage, we have a quick review question. Which of these is not released by the Krebs cycle? So again, I'll give you a few seconds to think about it, and then we'll go over all these answers. All right, so what about the first one, carbon dioxide? Well, yep, carbon dioxide is released by the Krebs cycle. So it makes it as a waste product, and that's what we actually end up breathing out. So that is released by the Krebs cycle. How about electron carriers? Yes, that's its main job is it makes these electron carriers, both kinds, NADH and FADH2. How about pyruvic acid? Is that released by the Krebs cycle? Well, we see it up here, but pyruvic acid is going into the Krebs cycle. That's what gets broken to kind of start the whole cycle. It gets broken up and used. So it's not released, it's used up. And our last one, two ATP molecules are released by the Krebs cycle. All right, and our last step of cellular respiration, the third stage, is called the electron transport chain. So electron carrier molecules from glycolysis and the Krebs cycle begin the electron transport chain. The high-energy electrons go through a series of carriers that reside on the mitochondria's inner membrane. As they move through, they cause hydrogen ions to be pumped across the membrane. Oops. Oh no, what did I do? Okay, let's start this animation over. So your high-energy electrons go through a series of carriers that reside on the membrane, and they cause the hydrogen ions to be pumped across the membrane. Now there's a buildup of hydrogen ions in one place that causes a pressure. And they want to get away from each other, so they diffuse out of the membrane through a protein called ATP synthase. The motion of the ions through that protein is what drives the creation of ATP from ADP. So one more time, sorry that it got messed up, but it's working now. So you've got your electron goes through the electron transport chain and pushes some hydrogen ions through. It loses its energy in the process. It used the energy to do that. Now you have all these hydrogen ions stuck on this side of the membrane, and they want to get away from each other, so they get pushed through the ATP synthase. And every time one goes through, it turns the mechanism that creates an ATP. And it's important to know that this happens inside of the mitochondria on an inner membrane inside of that organelle. Okay, so let's look at our totals. The whole goal of the process of cellular respiration is to make ATP, which carries energy around the cell. From one glucose molecule, glycolysis makes a net total of 2 ATPs, the Krebs cycle makes 2 ATPs, and the electron transport chain makes 32 ATPs. I just want to note that we have been using glucose as a common example, but other simple sugars and lipids and proteins can also be broken down into molecules that feed glycolysis or feed the Krebs cycle. So we talk about glucose a lot. It's the main basic example, but there's other molecules that can cause this process to happen and make ATP as well. So we keep mentioning that glycolysis does not need oxygen, but the other two phases do. But we haven't really shown oxygen being used yet. So why do they need the oxygen? So the only reason that we need to breathe in oxygen is that it goes into this cycle, it collects electrons at the end of the electron transport chain, and then combines with hydrogen ions to make water and takes the water away. If oxygen is not present to do this, the electrons stay at the end of the chain, blocking it up, and the whole process gets backed up all the way to the Krebs cycle, which stops the Krebs cycle from running. So the mitochondria need an adequate supply of oxygen to keep those electrons cleared out so that the process of respiration can continue. So cellular respiration can only be completed when the oxygen has an adequate supply of oxygen. I'm sorry, when the cell has an adequate supply of oxygen. But there is an alternative process that can be used when there's not an adequate supply of oxygen. This can happen in organisms that live where there is no oxygen, and it can happen in your cells when needed. So glycolysis is fast. It can make thousands of ATP molecules within milliseconds. So if you're in the middle of an intense workout, your cells may be using up their oxygen so quickly that the electron transport chain isn't able to keep up with glycolysis. When this happens, an alternative process takes place that doesn't need oxygen, and this alternative is called fermentation. Okay, so remember that glycolysis happens without oxygen. We just need the oxygen at the end of the electron transport chain so that the rest of cellular respiration can keep running. So if there is no oxygen, the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain will stop, but glycolysis can keep happening. It can keep making ATP in small amounts and making those electron carriers. So if that's the case, we need an alternative. What do we do with that ATP and those electron carriers? How do we keep glycolysis going since it can work without oxygen? So, oops, there we go. Fermentation is what's going to take place. Fermentation is an alternative way to use electron carriers produced by glycolysis. It does not make ATP itself, but fermentation just allows glycolysis to keep happening and producing small amounts of ATP very quickly. Fermentation changes the NADH to NAD+, so that the NAD+ can be reused again for more glycolysis. The electrons that were carried by the NADH get used to break up a molecule, releasing carbon dioxide and either creating alcohol or lactic acid molecules. So yeast cells use alcoholic fermentation when oxygen is not present. We harness this process to make bread and make alcoholic beverages with the yeast. Bacteria use lactic acid fermentation to make cheese, yogurt, and sour cream from milk. And your muscles use lactic acid fermentation when an intense burst of activity deprives them of oxygen. For example, when running too fast, your muscle cells are performing respiration and lactic acid fermentation. Your oh, sorry. Your muscles can be sustained by lactic acid fermentation for about 90 seconds of running. After that, they have to go back to relying purely on respiration. Okay, so some end of the section review. What does fermentation do? So we just talked about it as an alternative to respiration, but what does it actually do? I'll let you think about it for a few seconds. All right, so our options, what does fermentation do? Does it make a lot of ATP? No, fermentation itself actually does not make any ATP. Its job is just to keep glycolysis going by making NAD+. So remember, glycolysis makes some ATP, and it also makes that electron carrier, NADPH. So fermentation's job is just to break up that NADPH, send the NADP plus back to the beginning so that glycolysis can keep going. And our last options, does fermentation start working when there's a lot of oxygen? No, it works when there is not enough oxygen. It's an alternative that we can use when there's no oxygen. And does it break down lactic acid or alcohol? No, that's what it creates. So again, there's two types of fermentation, lactic acid fermentation, alcoholic fermentation. They do the same thing, just with different molecules. So one creates the lactic acid, one creates the alcohol. And one more review question. Where is most of the ATP made in cellular respiration? Is it made during glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, or the electron transport chain? So remember our totals. Glycolysis makes 2 ATP, the Krebs cycle makes 2 ATP, and the electron transport chain makes 32 ATP molecules. So that actually brings us to the end of the chapter. If you have any questions, this is how you can contact your instructor. It's actually not letting me stop the recording, so those of you that are here, now is a great time to ask questions. I'm done presenting, so I'm going to be quiet and let you have the floor. I'm going to stick around for a few minutes and just wait for questions to come in. So if you want me to go back to anything, I will. If you want me to go over something else, I will. If you have any questions about this chapter at all, just type them up and I will answer them. I had a good question from Shamika asking about textbooks. So some of you might be here that didn't start the biology class, so I just want to let you know there is a textbook for this class. Depending on which version you're signed up for, either you get the textbook shipped to you or there's an online textbook. And you'll find this for 5 of your classes in the program. Biology, earth science, American history is the first one that you get that has a textbook. And then at the end, world geography and literature. Those classes all have a textbook in addition to the assignments from Penn Foster. So most of your studying needs to be from the textbook because that's where the test questions are from. So these online sessions are just designed to be extra help. If you're not in the class yet and you come to a lesson like this and it's overwhelming, that's okay. That's probably because you didn't, read the book first. So we do save the recordings from these and we'll email them to you. And when you get to the class, if you didn't start it yet, you can request to get all those recordings and then you could watch them at your leisure. And I'm going to give you guys 1 more minute for questions and then I'm going to head out. So if you have any questions, you should ask them now.